Rain had been falling over the Anzio Beachhead for so many nights that men no longer looked up when it started. They only adjusted what could still be adjusted. They pulled helmets lower, shifted rifles to the dry side of their bodies, and stamped their boots in trench slime, while German guns searched the flats beyond the ruined factory east of town. By the middle of February 1944, the ground no longer behaved like land. It dragged at ankles, swallowed equipment, and held the mixed smell of cordite, fuel, wet wool, and opened flesh. Sergeant Frank Austin, 27 years old, silver star on his record and mud to his knees, moved through that ground as if habit could still carry a man after belief had gone. He led the scout section for B Company, 179th Infantry Regiment, 45th Infantry Division, and that job meant he was supposed to know where American wire ended and where German fire lanes began. On the night that started everything, he took 8 men out through a gap in the line, crossed no man's land by compass and memory, and crawled them toward a German listening post near the factory ruins. The patrol worked because Frank had learned the kind of patience the beachhead demanded. He timed their movement between artillery bursts, froze them flat under a flare, and sent 2 riflemen left while he cut up the center with a Thompson across his forearms. They came back with 1 prisoner. On paper, it was a clean success. The cost came on the return. A replacement kid from Oklahoma froze hard in an open stretch of mud and pissed through his trousers into his boots. Frank had to kick him forward before the next burst of fire found them. Back in the trench, with the prisoner already headed rearward, the kid stood shaking too badly to untie his laces. Frank told him that next time he could wet his pants if he liked, but not his boots, because nobody was carrying a man who froze his own feet. The line steadied the others. It also told them what kind of man they needed him to be, and that price was getting harder for him to pay. Later, after the patrol broke up, Frank found a thin beachhead dog hiding under an overturned ammunition crate. He broke a hard biscuit in half and tossed 1 piece into the dark. A corporal asked what the dog was called. Frank said that anything trying to survive until morning had no business carrying a name. The men laughed because it sounded hard. Frank had not meant it as wit. He had meant it as arithmetic. He had not slept properly in weeks. Sleep came in bursts too short to be useful, each one broken by the certainty that a shell had already landed and he had somehow missed the sound. The headaches began behind his left eye and spread down the side of his face until light itself felt sharp. He had taken a concussion months earlier near Salerno and never admitted how often the world now arrived a beat too late. He could still do the job. That was the trap. Men who could still do the job were not allowed to be broken, and men with medals least of all. A battalion surgeon finally caught him after Frank blanked out in a communication trench and came back with 1 hand on the wall. The surgeon asked questions Frank did not want to answer, then sent him rearward for 48 hours of observation at a British hospital section near the beach. Frank argued once. The surgeon told him that if he kept seeing double on patrol, he would get men killed. That ended the discussion. The 56th London General Hospital's forward section sat under canvas and sandbags not far from the beach, close enough to the guns that every lull felt borrowed. Inside, the sounds changed, but did not soften. Men moaned instead of shouting. Stretchers slapped tent flaps. Somewhere close by, a surgeon was asking for more light. Frank arrived with a paper tag on his jacket and the embarrassment of a man who had spent too long being useful to admit he was now 1 more problem. He noticed Emily Waters because she was reading a letter to a 1-legged infantryman as if the next paragraph still mattered. She was 28, English, narrow-faced, her uniform clean only where no available stain had reached. There was nothing bright about her. The war had taken that away. But there was steadiness in the way she stood by the cot, 1 hand on the paper, the other near the blanket, as if she could keep the room from tilting by holding 1 corner of it still. Later she brought Frank a tin cup of tea while he sat waiting for another examination. He asked her how she managed to look at men in pieces all day and keep moving. She said she did not look at what was gone. She looked at whatever part of tomorrow had not yet been destroyed. The answer should have sounded rehearsed. It did not. Frank found that he had no reply. He saw her again carrying blood-soaked dressings toward a burn pit, then outside a tent flap in the rain with half a cigarette and no shelter for the match. They spoke very little, which mattered because it kept the contact from becoming performance. They worked in different departments of the same machine, and were beginning to understand that the machine had no intention of stopping before it consumed the rest of them. Then the Germans shelled the hospital after dark. The first rounds landed short. The next bracket walked inward. Tent roofs shook. Men on litters shouted before the blasts hit, because the whistle alone could set them off. Frank was outside a treatment tent when Emily came through the smoke carrying morphine ampules in a canvas pouch. A shell burst behind them, dropping dirt and splinters over both of them. He seized her by the arm and dragged her toward a revetted shelter cut into a berm. They fell in together as another blast hit the perimeter and turned the air white with grit. The shelter was barely large enough for two people to sit upright. Outside, metal struck metal, men cried for stretcher teams, and somebody screamed for a sister who did not answer. In the dark, with the earth jumping around them, the neat walls between duty, loneliness, exhaustion and desire gave way all at once. Emily said she was tired of holding boys together with bandages when the day kept finding new ways to open them. Frank said he was tired of leading men out into the rain and pretending the difference between courage and habit still meant anything. That was when she admitted she had thought about leaving too, not returning to England, not asking for transfer, leaving this, all of it. Frank told her there might be a way north after the next dark cycle, through an abandoned irrigation channel east of the factory line, around a patch of German wire he had studied on patrol. He heard how mad it sounded and kept talking anyway. A village inland, an Italian guide if luck held, Rome after that, Vatican territory if miracles existed. Emily asked what would happen if they were caught. Frank answered that it would be quicker than dying by inches here. She did not say yes, but she did not say no, and that was enough. By morning, the shelling had eased, and their brief conspiracy had to fold itself back into routine. Before Frank's observation period could end properly, word spread through the hospital that German forces were massing for another major attack. Rest periods were cancelled. All men fit to return to their units were to go at once. Frank found Emily beside a supply cart and told her 2 nights. No sooner, no later. She nodded once and turned back to work because there was no room in daylight for anything else. He returned to the line with the same rank on his sleeve, the same weapon in his hands, and none of those things meant what they had meant 48 hours earlier. The rain came with him. The German counterattack hit on the 16th with tanks, mortars, machine gun belts, and a pressure that made the whole sector feel less like a battlefield than a wall being pushed inward by iron. Frank rejoined B Company near the forward trenches east of the factory, and before he had finished passing on patrol notes, the line began to bend. Men who had spent weeks crouched in rain-filled holes now had to stand and run through shell bursts because staying put meant burial. Orders changed by the minute. Boundaries dissolved. Units mixed. One lieutenant was shouting for a platoon that no longer existed. Frank found himself moving from crater to crater with the same replacement kid he had kicked 2 nights before. The kid had dried his boots, but not his fear. They fired at muzzle flashes, at shadow movement beyond the wire, at anything that looked like pressure coming through smoke. At some point, a shell struck close enough to lift Frank half off the ground and throw him backward into a crater half full of rainwater. When he clawed back to himself, the kid was lying twisted against the crater wall with his chest opened by shrapnel. One gloved hand was still clenched around an envelope that had somehow stayed dry inside his jacket. Frank tried to call out. The barrage swallowed his voice. He stayed in that crater through the rest of the night because every attempt to move drew bullets across the rim. The kid was dead within minutes, but Frank could not stop looking at the hand closed around the letter. The detail had no military value. That was why it mattered. The dead were manageable when they were functions of the front. A letter from home, never posted back into the world, made the death specific in a way artillery alone did not. Frank did not take the envelope. He sat with his head pounding and understood that if he climbed out at dawn and went back toward the line, he would keep doing this until the war ended, or his own body made the decision for him. Toward first light, the fire slackened enough for him to move. He pulled himself over the crater lip, looked once toward the positions where B Company should have been, saw only smoke, wire, and men moving too far away to identify, and turned the other direction. The act took less than 3 seconds. It cost him the life he had known. He headed for the hospital with the concentration of a man crossing a room to retrieve the one thing he has decided he cannot leave behind. He found Emily in a supply tent, packing bandages into a satchel that was too small to hold any future worth the risk. She looked at his face once and knew the decision had already been made. There was no time for argument. She took morphine, sulfur, dressings, a canteen, and half a blanket. Frank took his Thompson, a Colt, 2 grenades, a compass, and the map in his head. At dusk they slipped away separately and met behind a row of disabled ambulances at the edge of the Beachhead Road. Their first stretch through the outer dark went better than it had any right to. Rain damped sound. The ground, though foul, also kept them low. Frank used shell holes and drainage ditches he already knew, moving Emily behind him with a hand signal every few yards. Once they lay flat, while a flare rose over the factory ruins and turned the flooded fields into polished silver. The success of that first hour did something dangerous. It suggested that skill and luck might truly carry them. The abandoned irrigation channel lay where Frank remembered it, a cut in the land half choked by reeds, debris, and caved banks. At its entrance they found 2 other Americans crouched under the lee of a broken wall. One was a thin rear-area clerk with cracked spectacles. The other was a light infantryman with a bandaged arm and a face gone gray from fatigue. Both had the look Frank was beginning to recognize. Not panic, not simple cowardice, but the exhausted clarity of men who no longer believed the official future applied to them. They had heard about the channel from somebody who had heard about it from somebody else. That alone told Frank the route was not the private key he had imagined. He should have sent them away. More men meant more noise, more delay, more chances to go wrong. Instead, he let them in because sending them back would have meant ordering them toward a line he himself had abandoned. The 4 of them entered the channel together, single file, with Frank leading and Emily third. The channel narrowed as it ran inland. Overhanging brush cut the sky into strips. Water collected in black pockets at the bottom, and sections of bank had collapsed into slick clay shelves. Frank moved by compass and memory, counting bends, measuring distance by strain and time. It should have been enough. Then they heard German voices ahead, low and close, followed by the metallic cough of a rifle bolt. A patrol was moving across their route exactly where retreat would make as much noise as advance. There was no good decision left. Frank tried to press everyone down against the bank and let the patrol pass. But the clerk lost his footing, slid into standing water, and gave one short cry. A flashlight beam snapped toward them. Someone shouted in German. Frank fired first. The Thompson tore the dark open. The Germans answered with rifles and a machine gun farther back than Frank had expected. The clerk folded almost at once, struck high in the throat. The wounded infantryman fired 2 wild shots, and then screamed that his leg was gone. The skirmish ended as abruptly as it began. The Germans withdrew upslope, perhaps thinking they had hit a larger force. Frank checked bodies by touch. The clerk was dead. The infantryman had taken a round through the thigh. Blood soaked his trouser leg and spread into the channel water in a dark ribbon. Emily dropped to her knees with dressings, but one glance told Frank the real problem. The man could not walk. Carrying him meant stopping, lifting, slowing, speaking. It meant converting a narrow hope into none at all. The wounded soldier grabbed Frank's sleeve and begged him not to leave him there. He only asked not to be handed to the Germans alive. Frank looked at Emily. He saw the knowledge in her face before she said anything. He could take her, or he could take the man. He could not take both. All the talk of escape, love, and tomorrow collapsed into weight and distance and human limits. Frank pried the man's fingers off his sleeve one by one. Emily said his name once, very quietly, not to stop him, but because witnessing the choice was its own wound. Then she stood. Frank pulled her onward. They had gone perhaps 50 yards when the single shot came from behind them. Then a second. Frank did not turn around. Until then, he had still been able to imagine himself as a man trying to save one life from a war that had already stolen too many. After the shot in the channel, he understood that love, in practice, was making him choose which stranger would die unhelped. The knowledge did not stop him. That was worse. Near midnight, they emerged from the channel and crossed low ground toward a deserted farmhouse. The structure had taken shell damage, but still held 3 walls and part of a roof. Frank left Emily in the kitchen, ruin, and moved room to room with his pistol drawn. It was empty. He checked the yard, the barn shell, the line of cypresses beyond the road. Nothing. For the first time since dusk, he let himself think they might actually survive until morning. When he came back through the farmhouse door, 3 American military policemen were standing over Emily. The tallest of them, a captain in a rain-dark overcoat with a face too controlled to belong anywhere but law or intelligence, turned toward Frank with professional patience. Emily's wrists were bound with signal wire. She was not struggling. The captain said they had been waiting for him, and asked whether he was surprised to learn that frightened men tended to share the same rumors about routes out. He gave only his rank and name. Captain Bain. Bain said he had orders to intercept deserters, malingerers, and any soldier trying to quit the beachhead without authority. Examples were needed. The line was cracking in places, and fear had to be pointed the correct direction. Frank understood at once that the worst danger on this journey had never been German fire alone. Enemy bullets could kill the body. The institution behind his own shoulder straps could decide afterward what his life or death would mean. Bain informed him that both he and the nurse would be taken back to the beachhead for immediate processing and tribunal action. The phrase was colder than any threat. It meant forms, witnesses, conclusions. It meant chaos translated into sentences. Frank looked at Emily under the roofless edge of the farmhouse and made the only move still available to a man cornered by procedure. He said he knew the location of a concealed German supply point inland and offered to lead the MPs there in exchange for the nurse's release. Bain considered the proposal and agreed to postpone formal arrest long enough to verify the information. But he added terms. Frank would walk in front and clear the route with his own feet. The nurse would remain tied in the middle of the column. If Frank lied, she would suffer first. If he ran, they would shoot her, and then him. They set out before dawn, through low fields where rainwater lay over clay in broad, dark sheets. Bain kept 2 MPs close to Emily and 1 on Frank's back. Frank led them northeast, angling toward ground he knew had become unreliable after weeks of shelling and flood. It was not a formal minefield. It was worse in one way because maps did not mark treacherous mud with certainty. His offer about the German supply point had enough truth in it to be useful. He had seen mule tracks and shadow movement in that direction on earlier patrols. But the real destination in his mind shifted the moment Bain accepted the bargain. There would be no clean exchange, no release, no restoration of ordinary rules. If he could tear the column open for even half a minute, Emily might run. He no longer believed in Rome, or the Vatican, or the geography he had used to dress despair in practical clothing. He believed only in intervals. A minute, 50 yards, one unguarded direction. The first MP went under almost without warning. He stepped where the surface looked solid, sank to the thigh, tried to wrench free, and drove himself deeper. The sound he made was not a soldier's controlled curse, but a raw cry of surprise. Bain shouted for everyone to spread out and lie flat, which was good marsh discipline and impossible under panic. The second MP lunged to help and nearly followed him in. Frank had already moved sideways to firmer ground. Emily stumbled as the man behind her yanked on the wire at her wrists. Mud sucked at boots. Rain blurred edges. Frank shouted that the safe line bent left. That was true for about 15 yards. It was enough. The trapped MP thrashed harder and disappeared to the chest. His rifle fell sideways and vanished. The column broke shape. Bain started to redirect them when a German flare shot up beyond a hedgerow to the east, hanging over the marsh in a white umbrella of light. Somebody had heard the shouting. The whole field brightened at once. Emily twisted with all her strength, and the wire around her wrists slipped against the sodden gloves of the MP holding her. Whether she meant to run to Frank or simply away from the nearest gun, he never knew. She broke free and lurched toward him through shin-deep water. Bain shouted. The nearest MP swung his rifle. At the same instant, German shots cracked from the hedgerow, then another burst from farther right where a listening post had clearly been hidden in the folds of the ground. American voices answered. The marsh became a blind knot of uniforms and muzzle flashes. Frank reached Emily just as she folded into him. At first he thought she had tripped. Then he felt the wet heat on his hands. A round had gone through her side and out high in the back. He dragged her down behind a slight rise in the muck, while bullets clipped reeds and threw water into the air around them. Bain was shouting for his men to flank right. One of the MPs was still screaming from the bog. The flare burned lower. A second one rose. Under that hanging daylight there was no cover worth the name. Emily tried to breathe and could not get enough air to do it cleanly. Blood bubbled at the corner of her mouth whenever she forced words through her chest. Frank pressed dressings against the wound out of pure reflex, the same useless reflex he had watched her perform on 100 men already leaving. It bought seconds and no more. Her eyes found his in a way that was steadier than the moment deserved. She told him he was not the names they would use. He was the only man who had tried to lead her out of the rain. The sentence came broken by coughs and the labor of dying, but the meaning arrived whole. She died before the second flare burned out. The world did not stop for it. German rounds were still snapping over the rise. Bain was still alive somewhere to Frank's rear, trying to recover command from a field that had turned against him. Frank looked towards the east and saw figures approaching through the low mist, helmets and weapons black under flare light. The urge to keep running, which had carried him from the crater to the hospital to the ditch and beyond, went out of him the instant Emily's body settled in his arms. When the German soldiers closed to shouting distance, Frank raised his empty hands and gave them the only sentence his exhausted mind could still shape in their language. He surrendered. Not because he had changed sides, not because he expected mercy. He surrendered because everything he had tried to save lay dead in the mud before him, and there was nothing left to bargain for. The Germans took him alive, and moved him north through holding cages, truck yards, rail sidings, and prison compounds until the war itself began to come apart around the edges. In 1945, he was liberated by advancing American armor after months in captivity farther north in the Reich. Within hours, he was back in the custody of his own military police, cleaner, better supplied, and no less interested in what he had done on the beachhead. The charges acquired shape slowly and then all at once. Desertion in the face of the enemy, conduct prejudicial to good order and discipline, trafficking with enemy information, culpable action contributing to the deaths of military police personnel during lawful apprehension. The list sounded almost elegant compared with the reality that had produced it. A crater, a letter in a dead boy's hand, a nurse under shellfire, a channel with one wounded man too many, a farmhouse, a marsh, a flare. But military law had no use for mud as explanation. At the tribunal in Munich, Frank watched officers, clerks, and advocates reconstruct his collapse into a sequence of deliberate acts. He could not even say they were wrong. That was the deepest cruelty of the proceeding. He had made each choice. He had left the crater. He had taken Emily. He had abandoned the wounded man in the channel. He had lied to Bain and led the column into ground he knew was dangerous. The law took those choices, cleaned the blood off them, separated them from terror, exhaustion, concussion, grief, and love, and displayed them one by one beneath bright administrative light. The medal went first. The silver star that had once fixed him in other men's minds as a reliable soldier was stripped from his record, as if revocation could reach backward and erase the patrols and the earlier bravery that had earned it. Dishonorable discharge followed, then confinement. The sentence was 20 years of labor before later review cut it down, but nothing important returned with the reduction. He moved west after release to California, where a man could disappear into loading docks, rented rooms, and casual work without explaining much. He held jobs when he could, drank too often, and never married. There were nights when rain against a window still brought back the sound of flare-lit water struck by rifle fire. He kept almost nothing from the war. No decorations for obvious reasons. No uniform. What remained in a drawer beneath old receipts and a broken watch was a photograph of Emily Waters taken near the hospital tents in February 1944. In the image, she was not smiling exactly, but there was the beginning of one, as if someone had interrupted fatigue for half a second, and she had almost remembered how another life might have looked. On the back, in his own hand, the ink long blurred by years and damp, he had written, Anzio, February 1944, the last rain. He died in 1965 at 48. Liver ruined, body worn out before its time. In the official record, he remained what the court had made of him. In the smaller record that mattered only to him, he remained something else as well. A man who had stepped out of a crater and chosen one human being over the machine built around them both. The choice had killed others. It had destroyed him. It had also been the only moment in that campaign when he stopped lying about what he wanted. Wars do not merely kill. They sort. They take a man once called brave and place him under enough rain, enough artillery, enough sleepless nights, enough evidence that all futures are counterfeit, until his best impulse and his worst act become impossible to separate. Frank Austin did not escape Anzio. He carried it out with him in the only form the war left available: guilt, memory, and the photograph of the woman who had believed that some fragment of tomorrow was still worth reaching for. He had failed to get her to Rome. He had failed to save the wounded man in the Channel. He had failed to remain the sort of soldier his citation described. Yet on the night she died, in the brief interval before the marsh, the flares and the court reclaimed everything. He had taken her farther from the tents and stretchers than anyone else ever would. It was not enough. It was all he had. For the rest of his life he lived inside the difference.